I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was raining that morning, the sort of reluctant drizzle Oxford knows too well, misting the air without ever committing to fall. I remember the smell first, damp stone, burnt coffee, and something faintly floral, as though the guest house itself were trying to recall a perfume long since faded. Mrs. Diamond was waiting at the foot of the stairs, her hands clenched inside the folds of her apron. There's something in the way people stand when they've seen something they shouldn't. Their bodies seem to step back from themselves. She told me, in that trembling half-voice people reserve for the police, that the bed in room 6 had been made. Neatly, precisely, but untouched. Lewis had gone upstairs ahead of me, and I could hear him moving with that careful politeness of his, as if afraid to wake whoever might still be sleeping, but no one was. The door to room 6 was open. I remember the faint hum of the radiator, the faint scent of shaving soap, the dim grey light caught in the mirror. The bed was perfectly smooth. The pillow bore no indentation. On the small desk, a single sheet of paper waited beside a dry pen, and a rain-specked umbrella leaned by the chair. "He never slept there," she said again when I asked. Her tone was half statement, half plea for it not to mean what it clearly did. She'd made breakfast early that morning, bacon and eggs, but the man hadn't come down. It wasn't like him, she said. He'd seemed gentle, bookish, a professor, perhaps. I bent over the bed and saw it, an almost imperceptible fold near the corner of the sheet, as though a hand had hesitated there, uncertain whether to disturb it. Something about the precision unsettled me. People who make beds like that tend to do so from habit or guilt, and guilt, in my experience, is never uninteresting. Lewis found the man's suitcase in the wardrobe, packed with the orderliness of someone intending to stay only briefly. Shirts pressed, a small folio of notes, one paperback, Don's collected poems. The cover was dog-eared at the good morrow. I remember running my thumb over the lines, half aloud in my mind. For love, all love of other sights controls. The sort of thing only someone with unfinished business would bring to a guest house. The register downstairs listed him as Adrian Kerr. No home address, only St. Aldate's College. A common habit among academics, letting the college stand in for home, as if the stone walls could hide the absence of anything else. I'd heard of him, of course, a historian of 17th century literature, the kind of man who believed truth lay not in what people said, but in the way they chose to write it down. I suppose I've always sympathized with that view. Lewis stood at the window, watching the rain pool beneath the lamp-post. He asked if I thought Kerr had gone out during the night. I said perhaps. Or perhaps he'd simply stepped out of his life altogether. He frowned, used to more practical hypotheses, and said there were no signs of struggle, no disturbance, no reason to assume a crime. But absence, I reminded him, is as instructive as presence. What a person leaves behind tells you more than what they carry. I noticed something else. A glass on the bedside table, still damp at the rim, but no bottle near it. The faint scent of red wine lingered in the air, oddly misplaced in such a room. A solitary drinker leaves behind silence heavier than any quarrel. When Mrs. Diamond brought up the key, I asked if she'd touched anything. She shook her head. "Only the curtains," she said, "to let in the light." She seemed afraid of the silence, of the way the room refused to explain itself. I told her gently to lock it again. People forget how often mystery begins in the ordinary. The bed made too neatly, the poem left half-read. Downstairs, the wireless murmured faintly from her sitting room, a local station playing Mozart's clarinet concerto. The slow movement, of course, the one that never entirely resolves. I remember standing in the doorway, listening and thinking how absurdly beautiful it was to be haunted by a bed. That was the first day. Later, there would be letters, jealous colleagues, and the river. But in that moment, all I could see was the perfection of the sheet, the small indentation where a hand had paused. People vanish, but their gestures remain. I thought then, though I didn't say it aloud, that this was not a disappearance, but an erasure. Someone had gone to the trouble of removing not just the man, but the fact of his sleeping. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him nothing yet, but somewhere between Don's misplaced comma and the too perfect crease of the blanket, something had already begun to whisper. The kind of whisper that only Oxford and guilt and rain know how to make. Lewis brought the register while Rain fretted at the glass, and I handled it the way a priest handles an unsigned confession. Adrian Kerr in a thin scholastic hand. St. Aldate's College offered as an address, which is to say, a stone alibi. The capital R ended with a discreet flick. Vanity lives in endings. The flourish asks to be remembered by those who prefer not to be known. I asked Mrs. Diamond how he arrived. A taxi, after the 9 o'clock news. She remembered because the announcer mangled a foreign minister's name and he smiled without correcting it, the private pleasure of a man who harvests error. Did he bring much? Only a small suitcase and a leather folio. He carried an umbrella, though the rain had thinned. A person who keeps hold of shelter in clearing weather mistrusts improvement. Sometimes they are right. Lewis wondered if Kerr went out again in the night. Perhaps, I said. Or perhaps he never arrived in the way arrival is ordinarily understood. The bed upstairs had the stillness of a photograph. Only two types leave a bed immaculate, the scrupulous and the staged. On the counter, the bell had been leveled with a scrap of paper. I slid it free. Crossword clipping, last Saturday's, with several entries written in red. 4 down read one who never lies in bed. 4. The space contained maid, then a faint X and the letters rewritten, heavier, as though certainty required pressure. I kept the fragment. Red is the color of confidence when one hopes not to be challenged. We went to St. Aldate's. The porter gave us the tired courtesy of a man who has accepted that respectability is seasonal. Kerr's key still hung in its pigeonhole. Not since yesterday, he said, as if absence could be polished like silver. The staircase smelled of beeswax and old rain. Whispering felt redundant. Kerr's room was prim without being loved. Papers aligned for display. Don lay on the desk. The anniversaries open, a penciled gloss in the margin. Death be proud. It should be otherwise. Scholars misquote on purpose more often than by accident. It keeps the inattentive honest. The lower drawer yielded the leather folio unlocked. Lecture notes, letters, a clipped review, and a small envelope addressed to no one. Inside, 5 typed words. The bed was made, underlined once in pencil, with a tidy question mark leaning in like a listener. Perhaps he was meeting someone, Lewis said. He had a message at the lodge. Miss Lane called. The name settled with tidy insolence. Do you know her? He asked. Not yet, I said. I know the type. Clever, disciplined, carrying a history of forgiveness that never quite took. On the sill sat a taxi chit from Folly Bridge, time-stamped 2142. The guest house remembered his arrival soon after 9. Add the short drive, the untroubled umbrella, and the still bed, and one obtains a figure that refuses to balance. Either he left and returned invisibly, or he never meant to sleep at all. People make beds for guests. Conspirators make them for inspectors. Before we left, I looked again at the register. Beneath Kerr's name, the faint oval of a damp thumb lay at a rightward tilt. The mark did not align with his signature, but with the line below, as though someone steadied the book while writing under him. That writing had been lifted out. The stub of the page showed a cleaner edge than any housekeeper would cut. What do you think? Lewis asked. That a misquoted poet, a corrected crossword, and an untouched bed form a sentence with its verb missing, I said. The river will tell us, he answered. Rivers tell only what we already suspect. Still, suspicion makes a serviceable map, and I've always preferred maps that leave the margins blank. Night came early. Oxford kept its counsel. Oxford has its own seasons of deceit. Spring brings confession. Autumn, regret. It was late October when Lewis and I walked beneath the cloisters of St. Aldate's College, our footsteps absorbed by the rain-dark stone. The porter led us through the quadrangle with a politeness honed by centuries of secrecy. Every window glowed faintly, and I remember thinking that each light represented a private delusion someone was unwilling to extinguish. Professor Adrian Kerr had taught here for over 20 years. His name was spoken softly in the senior common room, as though intellect were a form of contagion. The dean, Sir Benedict Reeves, received us with the patient courtesy of a man long accustomed to the small humiliations of truth. He was tall, silver-haired, and faintly translucent, like parchment held to the light. A decanter of port stood between us, and he poured as though administering last rites. Kerr, he said, had been brilliant but difficult. He'd taken too many sabbaticals, asked too many questions that didn't need answers. The phrase lingered. I've never trusted questions that refuse their own answers. They usually conceal the one that matters. Dr. Phoebe Lane joined us halfway through the conversation. The room changed temperature at once. She was younger than I expected, though her composure suggested practice in disappointment. She spoke of Kerr's lectures, of his fondness for Don and Herbert, and of his habit of leaving a half-finished glass of claret on his desk. When Lewis asked about their relationship, she smiled with the grace of someone who has already been forgiven for too much. We worked together closely, she said, which can mean anything or nothing depending on who's listening. Behind her, the shelves carried a faint bloom of dust except for one narrow strip where a book had been removed recently. The absence left a mark, pale and rectangular, a ghost of order undone. The title beside it read, Poets and the Mortal Word. I made a mental note. After she left, Reeves mentioned a dinner the night before Kerr disappeared. A small gathering of scholars, Dr. Julian West, one of Kerr's protégés, had presented a paper. The discussion, Reeves said, had become heated over authorship and morality. I asked what topic could provoke both. Reeves hesitated, then said the paper questioned whether an academic thief could ever truly be exposed without incriminating his accuser. It was, he added, a hypothetical exercise. Hypothetical is the adjective people use when they wish morality were optional. We found Dr. West in the college library. He had the restlessness of a man born half a century too late for his own ambition. He spoke quickly, as if time itself were conspiring to interrupt him. He admired Kerr, he said, but admiration has a way of curdling into rivalry. Kerr was editing an unpublished elegy by a 17th-century poet, a discovery that might have secured him a fellowship abroad. I asked if West had seen the manuscript. Only once. Kerr was secretive. He said scholarship was like chess. Every move required the illusion of control. A draft moved through the reading room, rustling the papers between us. I noticed a crossword folded inside one of the volumes on the table, the same newspaper I'd found at the guest house. Several clues were filled in with the same red ink. I asked if it was his. He shook his head and looked away too, soon. The top corner bore the faintest impression of a wineglass ring. Patterns of habit outlast their owners. Lewis examined the logbook at the librarian's desk. Kerr had signed in on Tuesday afternoon and out at closing. West's name followed his, the handwriting close enough to touch. I traced my finger along the margin and found a smudge that didn't belong to either. Lipstick, faint coral. Lane's color. Deduction, like guilt, thrives on residue. When we stepped back into the quadrangle, the rain had stopped, but the stones still wept. Lewis asked what I made of them all. "Scholars," I said, "are amateurs of deceit. They annotate their lies until they resemble truth." He smiled the way he does when he knows I've begun to suspect too much. That evening, back in my flat, I opened Don again. "No man is an island," he wrote, but the college seemed precisely that, a walled island of intellect, surrounded by water as dark as ink. I thought of Kerr's untouched bed and of the book removed from the shelf. Somewhere between those silences lay the first faint echo of motive, delicate as a page turned by candlelight. 700 words. The river had a way of making silence seem earned. That morning it ran low beneath the Iffley lock, a sluggish mirror to the pale October sky. The willows leaned inward, their reflections stitched to the water by a fine seam of mist. I'd been there once before, different case, different ghost, but the same smell of cold reeds and faint diesel clung to the air, as if time in Oxford moved only in slow repetitions. Lewis walked a few paces ahead, his boots imprinting the mud with more confidence than I felt. The constable on duty lifted the tape, and we stepped through into the small clearing where the body waited. Professor Adrian Kerr had come to rest face down, half buried in silt, one arm caught beneath the root of a willow. There was nothing theatrical about it. Death had arrived with a bureaucrat's precision, efficient and embellished, without any apparent need for attention. The pathologist, Dr. Gilbert, greeted us with the weary civility of a man long resigned to the limits of anatomy. "Drowning," he said. "Likely slipped, perhaps struck his head." But I saw the faint indentation on the temple, more bruise than wound, and something within me resisted the convenience of it all. Kerr was no fool. He would not have wandered this far along the river alone, not with his folio missing and a life's work half concealed in it. Lewis crouched beside the body and noticed the wine stain on the collar, a deep claret hue that had survived the current. I could smell it too, faint but distinct, like the memory of a conversation one regrets ending too soon. The pathologist said it might have come from a bottle he carried, yet there was no bottle, no glass, not even a cork. Absence, I've learned, is Oxford's most common accessory. We followed the river bank a few hundred yards upstream. The grass flattened in two separate places, as though two people had stood there, one leaving before the other. A cigarette butt, soaked but intact, bore a faint trace of lipstick, coral again, the same color as Dr. Lane's that morning. Coincidence is merely laziness by another name, and I have never been fond of either. Lewis asked what I thought had happened. I told him only that the river had been an accomplice before, quiet, unopinionated, and perfectly content to conceal what people wished to forget. He didn't reply. He rarely does when he knows my thoughts have begun their private wanderings. Later, I sat on the lock gate and stared at the water. The rhythm of the current matched the uneven pulse behind my eyes. I took out my notebook and wrote one line from Donne. "No man is an island." Then beneath it, without thinking, another, "except the drowned." Kerr's misquoted poem returned to me, the deliberate inversion of sense, the quiet rebellion of intellect against accuracy. I began to wonder whether the error had not been a slip but a signal, a message to anyone patient enough to read him twice. The boatman who'd found the body came over, cap in hand, voice uncertain. Said he'd seen a light near the towpath the night before, someone holding a torch low, perhaps looking for something they'd dropped. He'd assumed it was a student, lost after too much wine. Oxford produces more of those than scholars. When he'd passed again an hour later, the light was gone. We thanked him, though gratitude felt oddly misplaced. The dead never thank us for what we find. The living rarely forgive us for what we understand. As we walked back, I looked once more at the river, the slow eddy where Kerr's body had turned. The water had resumed its habitual indifference, as if reclaiming him for a quieter truth. I thought of his untouched bed at the guest house, the crossword folded beneath the lamp, the red ink bleeding faintly at the corners. Patterns repeat until someone listens. Lewis offered me a cigarette. I declined, though I took one all the same. He said, "You think someone pushed him?" I said nothing. Instead, I watched the smoke drift and dissolve, following the same invisible path as the mist over the water. The difference between accident and design is often no more than the width of a breath, and somewhere beneath that calm, patient surface, I felt the first flicker of unease, the sense that Kerr's death was not an ending at all, merely a pause between stanzas in a poem that had yet to finish writing itself. 650 words. The lecture hall held a hush I've always loved. Wood worn by anxious hands, chalk haze in tall windows, the shy vegetable scent of damp gowns on radiators. I chose the middle row, the seat that lets one listen without being seen. Students arrived with forgiving indifference. She came last, unhurried, a slim folder under her arm, an entrance that pretends not to be noticed and succeeds. Phoebe Lane did not look like scandal. Her face had the composure of one who has learned not to display the question she most wants answered. Her voice settled the room without asking permission. She began with Don, lingered over Herbert, and wrote a line so carefully that the chalk squealed. I distrust carefulness. It advertises intention, and intention is where truth leaves fingerprints. Lewis had taken a place at the back. I felt his gaze when her eyes drifted toward the doorway, measuring a late arrival who would never arrive. She described an unnamed editor whose fidelity to text concealed a longing to be written into it. Pens scraped dutifully. One student underlined every third word, a method promising structure and guaranteeing failure. Afterwards, I waited while they filed out with their improving faces. She erased the board slowly, reading the vanishing lines as if they had been hers. I introduced myself. She said she had expected me sooner. I said I had waited to listen. She answered that listening was the most seductive violence. I said it was the second most. The exchange tasted of iron. We remained at the lectern. She asked whether the river had told me anything. I said it prefers the company of secrets. There were letters, anonymous, arriving for months, written in red by a scholar's hand you would trust until you noticed how much it enjoyed itself. Did they quote correctly? I asked. They never misquoted. They misapplied. Precision as provocation. Her palm rested on the waxed wood. A faint crescent pressed into the grain betrayed the habit of a wineglass at that spot. I wondered who drinks in lecture halls. Not undergraduates, whose bravery is noisier, and not porters. The lip had taken coral pigment into its ridge, a discreet tide line. Her hands were bare. Her mouth was not. I asked about the dinner after West's paper. She called it the usual operetta. Praise, envy, an encore of hints. Reeves presided with ecclesiastical tolerance. West smouldered. Kerr smiled as men smile when they intend to leave behind something that will outlive them. What did he leave? I asked. A promise, she said. Promises here are thin currency, I said. The board, now clean, showed the ghost of her sentence. Pressure marks where chalk pressed harder than thought required. People reveal themselves at the point of emphasis. She had underlined love not because the poem demanded it, but because her memory did. I told her so. For a moment, she looked at me with a weary tenderness reserved for fellow addicts. A student returned for a scarf and left a folded crossword on the desk as if it were a tip. I opened it. 4 down again, the same clue. Someone had written maid, erased it to maid, then altered it to Lane. Contrition posing as grammar. She said the paper was not hers. I believed her. The crumbs matched lodge graphite, and there was no red. When I asked whether she had visited Kerr at the guest house, her breath paused for the length of a comma. Once, briefly, to return a book. Which book? Herbert's Temple. I said. Kerr had misquoted Don on purpose. She smiled and observed that men devoted to accuracy forgive themselves the sin of precision. The smile ended before it reached the cupboard where warmth is kept. We left to the floorboard's low complaint. Outside, rain negotiated with stone and won by persistence. Lewis asked what I had gathered, that she reads like a surgeon and lies like a poet. Do you trust her? I trust her to be exactly as dangerous as she needs to be. I turned back and studied the faint twin underline, the trembling parallel a hand makes when it means to be steady. Certainty requires shadows. The Bodleian has a silence that feels less like absence of sound than the presence of something waiting. It was there, under the filtered light of a late afternoon, that Lewis and I were shown Kerr's last traceable footprints. The librarian, a man of brittle manners and powdered cuffs, spoke of him with the faint reverence Oxford reserves for the dead whose deaths are still mysterious. He came 3 days before he vanished, borrowed no books, copied something from special collections, and left before the clocks struck 5. The folio had not been seen since. I sat at the long table where Kerr had worked, the oak burnished smooth by centuries of restless inquiry. The surface bore faint indentations of handwriting, the sort one leaves after pressing too hard while trying not to think of something. The librarian said Kerr had been reading an unpublished elegy from a 17th century manuscript, a lament attributed, questionably, to Henry Vaughan. A poem about insomnia and repentance. The bed was made, yet I lay awake. One line had read. I knew it because I'd seen the photocopy left among his papers. Kerr's marginalia were cramped and feverish, as though the words themselves had been trying to keep him from sleeping. Lewis, always more literal, asked what the connection was between poetry and drowning. I told him the connection was Oxford. Here, words and water have equal appetites. He frowned, not for the first time, and I almost envied him the simplicity of his distrust. We requested the reader's log. Kerr's name appeared at 1402. Beneath it, another signature, almost illegible, but with a distinctive flourish to the L lane, Phoebe. I had expected her to appear again, though not quite so quickly. She'd been there that same afternoon, it seemed, consulting a different text, but at the same table. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford thrives on coincidence as churches do on faith. I asked the librarian whether he remembered her. Of course, he said, the lady scholar who insisted on handling the folio herself, though it required permission. Her gloves were red, he added, not the regulation white, the color of a cautionary footnote. When he left us, I examined the wastebasket near Kerr's chair. Among the crumpled sheets was a single torn strip of paper with 5 typed words. The bed was made. Again. But this time, the last word was underlined twice. Not once. The printer's ink had bled faintly at the edges, as though the key had been struck too hard. Kerr had been emphatic about something, perhaps about nothing, but the gesture mattered. Overstatement is a confession of fear. Lewis thought the note a fragment of the same message found in Kerr's folio. I thought otherwise. This copy had been made later, its paper of a slightly different grain, the tear neat, controlled. Whoever had typed it wanted to mimic the earlier note, to continue its grammar. People often believe that imitation hides them, but it only clarifies the outline. We walked out into Radcliffe Square as the light folded itself into the mist. The stones breathed with rain. Somewhere beyond, a choir rehearsed an anthem whose Latin I half recognized. Something about deliverance and forgetting. Lewis said the dean had asked if we'd made progress. I told him progress was a pedestrian word for what we were attempting. We were collecting echoes, not answers. Back at the station, I spread the photocopies of Kerr's notes on my desk. The elegy's final line read, "Sleep comes not to those who keep the truth awake." It sounded like the confession of a man undone by conscience. Yet in the margin, beneath the word sleep, Kerr had drawn a faint arrow leading to a scribbled word I could barely decipher. Lane? Or perhaps lame. The ambiguity pleased him, I think. It pleases me still. I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the photograph of the folio's missing cover. Vellum cracked and pale, a title nearly erased. Beneath the blur, I imagined another hand had written its own brief edition, something personal, something small enough to kill for. Oxford was closing around the case like a page folding back upon itself, and somewhere between the poem's confession and the folio's disappearance, I felt the uneasy certainty that both had been rewritten, once by a poet seeking absolution, and again by someone who mistook love for correction. The dean received us with the courtesy of a man who has rehearsed his innocence for years. His rooms looked over a small quadrangle where an apple tree kept the last leaves like unspent apologies. He arranged the decanter, placed 3 glasses precisely apart, and forgot my rank with an ease that suggested habit rather than insult. Titles, he observed, do not survive inquiry. He asked about progress. I said the river had yielded a body, and the library had mislaid a conscience. Kerr was brilliant, he said, but doctrinaire. He wanted virtue set to music in a town that prefers fugues. We spoke of the dinner after West's paper. The guest list was familiar. Reeves, West, Lane, 2 docile fellows, and Kerr, arriving late with a parcel in brown paper, string crossed twice. "A gift for the college," Reeves said. He couldn't recall which book. While he talked, I noticed a ledger on the sideboard beneath the port. The donations register, marbled spine open at a page of dates like a procession. Between 2 lines, a gap sat. Neither smudge nor crease, simply an interval the width of a thumb. I turned the page as if admiring the binding. The next date resumed 1 day later than the previous would allow. I asked if the ledger was complete. He said naturally, and refilled my glass with the same economy he offered truth. Lewis asked about the old scandal. Reeves sighed in that ecclesiastical way that grants absolution to chronology. "Years ago," he said, "a quarrel over a footnote became an inquiry into honor. The college prevailed by becoming silent. Kerr had been revisiting the files, mistaking curiosity for justice." I said curiosity and justice are cousins, separated by a scholarship. Reeves said zeal is vanity in academic dress. The port glass left a fresh ring on the ledger margin. Others had faded to a soft ash. Habit documents itself. I rested a fingertip inside the newest circle and felt the paper cool and damp. A man who stains the record he denies does not expect to be believed. He expects to be obeyed. On the mantel, a photograph showed young scholars by the same apple tree. At the edge stood a younger Reeves holding a book with its corner still in brown paper. I asked about keys. "Only the porter in emergencies," he said, and then rearranged his words as though syntax could launder intent. "Scholarship produces emergencies with remarkable regularity," I suggested. His hand counted the studs along the chair arm, a pilgrimage of 5 and back again. "When men count, they are building a small shelter." He permitted us the fellow's library log. The secretary brought it in a folder, anxious at the edges. Entries marched in immaculate script until the week before Kerr vanished, where 1 line had been scored through so finely that the paper gleamed. Erasure confesses more than ink. Which title had been corrected? I asked. "Procedure forbids disclosure," the secretary recited. The dean nodded in rhythm to a hymn only he could hear. Before leaving, I returned to the ledger. The gap troubled me. The width matched a pasted slip removed. The paste had tugged a pale nap from the paper. I've kept such books myself. A missing slip is a missing signature in another tongue. I asked whether gifts were ever retracted. Only for duplication, he said. Oxford suffers from too many copies. Outside, the garden kept the sort of quiet furniture remembers. Lewis asked what I had learned. A ledger that drinks, I said, and a man who edits the past in the future, perfect. The parcel at dinner was not a donation. It was a custody chain. Of what? He asked. Something that needs a librarian and a priest to bless it. At the gate, a notice board advertised a lecture on repentance pinned over an alumni appeal for legacies. Repentance and bequests make a tidy couple. I turned my collar to the thin rain and thought of Kerr's bed made with sacramental neatness, and of a ledger whose pause matched the fall of an apple, brief, undeniable, and conveniently explained by gravity. Truth, like fruit, bruises when handled gently. Morning arrived the color of old envelopes, and I woke with the taste of Mozart and stale sleep. On my desk lay the crosswords we had gathered from Kerr's room and the guest-house drawer, a confetti of squares and stubbornness. Red ink threaded through them like a minor injury. I have never trusted red. It flatters certainty, and certainty, in my trade, is the cheapest forgery. Lewis brought coffee, and the silence I rationed for myself. He asked, without asking, what the puzzles had told me. That someone wished to be overheard, I said, and chose a language public enough to pass unnoticed. I tapped 4 down, one who never lies in bed. On Kerr's sheet, the entry had wandered from maid to lane, each overwritten, darker than the last, as if pressure could revise time. I set the clippings in a row, 3 newspapers, same clue, same week, same pious red. The hand was cultivated. Tails on the G's dipped like cautious swallows. T's were crossed as if measured with string. The printer left a faint ghost of the grid on the reverse, and when I held 2 sheets together, the ghosts aligned to form a diagonal belonging to neither puzzle. Read the letters that touched it, and you obtained a simple announcement. Made, then left. Not clever, merely careful. At mid-morning, I returned to the guest house. Mrs. Diamond fussed with keys while the wireless hummed. On the side table lay a felt-tip pen, red, and a church newsletter with acrostics. She said the pen belonged to a previous tenant. The lady professor had borrowed it once, on a wet evening. In room 6, the bed still announced its virtue. I sat and let the air settle. On the underside of the desk drawer, a childlike arithmetic had been notched with a biro, 4 short scratches and a gate through them. A tally of visits, perhaps. I touched the marks and smelled the thin solvent of correction fluid. Someone had erased a mistake, then recorded the erasure. Lewis waited in the doorway with his decent patience. He found a taxi chit beneath the bin liner, cockled by damp. Folly Bridge again, a later time than the earlier slip. So Kerr left, or someone left as him, after he had already arrived. Beds remain untouched only when someone wants a witness who never speaks. We took the clippings to be photographed and went to the library. In the north reading room, a pencil lay where pencils go to be forgotten. Scarlet shavings clung like fish scales. I imagined gloves, red, not white, and a body leaning low over the grid so no one would see the lesson. Lane met us by the catalogue bay. She saw the clippings and did not touch them. Puzzles cure grief better than faith, she said. Puzzles postpone it, I answered. Does the river allow postponements? She asked. Only for those who bring gifts, I said. I returned to the squares. 5 across read remain set straight. I filled adjusts, then crossed it. The truer answer was lice in state, a vulgarity masquerading as wit. Beneath the grid, impressed by pressure from another page, a faint word resolved when angled to the light. Porter. Not a solution, a reminder. The porter had fetched a ledger at the Dean's. The ledger had drunk more than I did. Evening pressed its damp palms against the windows. I sorted the clippings again and saw another alignment. the unchecked letters down all 3 puzzles spelled gate. A gate by the river had lodged Kerr's arm. I poured a whiskey and wrote the word twice. Then underlined it softly. Some words deserve repetition. It is repetition that kills them. When Lewis asked whether I had a theory, I told him only that whoever writes in red thinks themselves merciful. They send clues like indulgences, absolutions purchased with ink. Mercy and vanity share a pew. I put out the light and listened to the house settle. The squares, pale in the dark, seemed to breathe, and somewhere between their shallow certainties and the deeper silence of water, I felt the case adjust itself by a barely audible click, like a letter sliding into place. Lewis was the one who believed we'd finished it. He said it the way a man says the word dinner after a long day, with faith that the worst is behind him. West had confessed enough by silence. His fingerprints on Kerr's folio, his nervousness polished to transparency, his resentment so earnest it almost became evidence. The dean had signed the statement. The press would soon distill tragedy into scholarship. I poured a whiskey that evening, not to celebrate, but to delay the taste of doubt. The city outside was washed by a clean, tired rain. It had that particular Oxford hush, the sound of footsteps already regretting themselves. I reread West's testimony. The lines carried more effort than guilt. He had said he'd gone to the guest house to reason with Kerr, that they argued, that he left before midnight, leaving Kerr alive. The hour troubled me. Arguments, unlike debts, are rarely left tidy. Lewis said he was convinced the motive fit neatly, the timing, the jealousy. West wanted the poem, the recognition, the fellowship. He took what he thought he deserved and left the rest to the river. But neatness is not proof. In Oxford, it's camouflage. At the station, the file sat waiting under a weak lamp. I looked again at the photograph of Kerr's desk, the crossword in red ink, the unlit lamp, the glass of wine that reflected the window bars. There was something about the wine that unsettled me. Too full, too clean around the rim. Kerr had not drunk it. Someone had poured it for him, or for themselves. I remembered Dr. Lane's words. He left his glass unfinished. Perhaps it wasn't his at all. I turned back to West's statement. He said the bottle had been open. He had poured 2 glasses to appear calm, to appear equal. But the autopsy found traces of the same vintage in Kerr's stomach, enough to suggest he'd drunk before West arrived. 2 glasses, 1 empty before the guest arrived. 1 poured after. The arithmetic felt wrong. Lewis called it overthinking. He reminded me the fingerprint report matched. The folio held West's touch. The anonymous letters had ended the week he was arrested. But guilt rarely keeps a schedule. I told him to fetch the folio once more. When it arrived, I ran a finger down the margin of Kerr's final note. The indentation of the pencil caught a faint reflection from the lamplight, and there, beside the word sleep, was an impression too shallow for ink, yet too deliberate for chance. A faint arc, the ghost of an initial, not a W and L Lane. The same red ink had marked her lecture notes. The same crossword letters shaped her name beneath a different clue. Yet she'd seemed too fragile, too refined for violence. I thought of her voice in that quiet hall, her refusal to touch the clippings, a refusal that required knowledge of what they were. She had been correcting the narrative as she went. Misquotes, misplaced lines, the final red punctuation of the drowned man. West, poor fool, had merely been the noise around her silence. I didn't tell Lewis. He likes conclusions that can be written in a report. Mine was less obliging. I walked that night to the river, where the lights of the lock blurred into slow gold threads. The gate creaked, half open, as if waiting for correction. The air smelt of wet paper and iron. I thought of Kerr's poem. The bed was made, yet I lay awake, and of the kind of love that mistakes possession for proof. Somewhere behind the reeds, a night-bird startled, the sound too sudden, too human. I turned, half expecting to see her shape by the path, half hoping I wouldn't. But there was nothing. Only the small persistence of the current, whispering that endings are merely the points where men grow tired of asking questions. Lewis would close the file the next day. The dean would sleep again. Oxford would resume its patient deceit, and I, as ever, would remain awake, counting the unsolved syllables in other people's elegies. It was near midnight when I returned to the guest house. Oxford had folded itself into that particular stillness which feels earned rather than imposed, a city asleep under its own weight of memory. The rain had stopped, though its scent remained. Wet stone, paraffin, something faintly medicinal from the drains. Mrs. Diamond had gone to bed. Only the hallway lamp was left burning, its yellow light reaching no further than the first flight of stairs. I let myself into room 6 and found the air exactly as I remembered it. Neither warm nor cold, only balanced, like a thought held in suspension. The bed was still made. Perfectly. The same hospital corners, the same folded blanket at the foot. It looked not like an invitation to rest, but a quiet rebuke to the living. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening for the small noises houses make when they forget you're listening. A clock somewhere downstairs sighed its way toward 12. I sat on the edge of the bed, half expecting the linen to yield, but it resisted, unyielding as a conscience. Lewis would have said there was nothing to be found. The case, to his mind, was done. West had confessed enough by accident, the dean by omission, Lane by silence. But completion never sits well with me. I've always distrusted endings that close too neatly. I reached for the bedside drawer. Inside lay the remnants of an ordinary life. 2 pens, one black, one red. A railway timetable folded to an obsolete date, and beneath them a page torn from Kerr's notebook. The ink had run slightly at the edges, as though once touched by damp fingers. The bed was made. She never slept there. The pronoun struck me first. Not he, but she. I wondered if Kerr had meant himself, or someone else. Perhaps both. I found the bottle of wine on the sill, still half full, the cork forced in backwards. I poured a measure into the glass and watched the surface settle. The reflection of the ceiling bulb quivered, a trembling sun. It reminded me of the river that morning when they pulled him out, the same pale light struggling to mean something. I took a sip. It was poor wine, sweet, the kind that lingers too long after it's been swallowed. A gust nudged the curtains. In the mirror opposite, I saw my own face made strange by the dimness. A detective is only ever the echo of the crime he solves. Perhaps that's why we fade the way we do. On the desk, the crossword waited. The red ink had browned slightly, oxidized into irony. I traced the squares again. Maid, Lane, and beneath it, faint but present, another word written so lightly I'd missed it before. Laid. 4 letters, the same number as the clue required. But the hand was different, a woman's, more elegant, less sure. Lane's, perhaps. A shared puzzle between lovers, turned confession between ghosts. I looked to the carpet near the bed and noticed, for the first time, the smallest blemish of wax near the leg of the table. A candle's accidental tear. The maid had missed it when she cleaned. I crouched, ran a finger over the hardened drop. Pale ivory, romantic, almost devotional. Kerr had not drowned by chance. He'd been chosen as one chooses a verse to misquote, deliberately, tenderly, cruelly. Outside, the wind gathered again, unsettling the ivy against the pane. I could almost hear her voice in the pattern, Lane's low, deliberate tone, the way she'd said poetry was the only truth that allowed lying. She had killed him with precision, but what she couldn't erase was that last line, that confession folded into syntax. The bed was made. She never slept there. a woman's remorse written in a man's hand. Lewis called me the next morning, said the Dean had died in his sleep. Stroke, according to the doctors, though I suspected relief. West had withdrawn his plea, blaming panic and wine. Lane had left the college, a note on her desk quoting Don again. For love, all love of other sights, controls. It was an apology or a boast. I couldn't decide. I stayed a while longer in the room until the first suggestion of dawn crept over the rooftops. The city stirred. A milk float whined distantly. I finished the bottle, left £2 on the dresser, and closed the door behind me. Downstairs, Mrs. Diamond had placed fresh lilies in the hallway vase. The smell was almost too clean. As I stepped into the chill air, I looked once more toward the window of room 6. Curtains drawn, everything immaculate. The bed was made. I imagined her standing there the night it happened, watching him pour the wine, hearing his recitation of a line she'd once corrected, his voice warm, unaware. She'd placed the letter beside the lamp, smoothed the sheets, and walked out into the dark that loves Oxford most. I never saw her again. Sometimes, late, when the music stops and the whiskey settles, I think of that bed. The line of it, the refusal to yield. Some truths, like certain kinds of love, are tidy only when they've stopped breathing.